My name is Jeremy Hauser, along with my colleague Mac McHargue. Our chapter presentation was Chapter 9, Instructional Design and Workforce Education. We were also able to interview James Johnson. He's the Director of Hospital Education at Martin Army Community Hospital. We thought this would be imperative to have someone currently in the field that has 20 plus years of experience in workforce education to discuss some of the things he sees or he does on a daily basis, if you will.
Hello, my name is James Johnson. I'm a training specialist here at Martin Army Community Hospital, and my background in education is I hold a master's degree in healthcare management. I've been doing education and training for a number of years and started working here about 9 years ago. I also am an adjunct professor at Millamont Technical College, and my teaching background spans about 30 years, which involves my military career as well as my civilian career. And I'm here today to just answer some questions and give you some insight on education and my theory on it.
This book does a really good job of condensing a lot of the key aspects that are really involved with designing instruction. When you talk about that concept in general, designing instruction, I mean, you could write an entire book about that or have an entire course based on that one concept. So I felt like the authors of this book did a pretty good job of condensing all that into a short, 12 to 15 page chapter. What we're going to be talking about out of the chapter will be, first of all, some different philosophies of learning. We'll look at some of the similarities and differences between education and training. We'll talk about just a few of the variables that you encounter when you go to design instruction. We'll talk about preparing instruction, which is a very extensive part of the design process. We'll also talk here about some principles that the book puts forth that need to be addressed when you're preparing your instruction. We'll talk a little bit about the adult learner, and then we'll have a conclusion and summarize what we've discussed throughout the entire presentation. We'll begin by discussing some of the more common philosophies associated with learning, which are behaviorism, cognitivism, constructivism, and a synthesis approach to learning. Beginning with behaviorism, here we have a philosophy which has its roots in the research of men such as Edward Thorndike and B.F. Skinner. We define learning here as when a change occurs in an individual's behavior. So for example, we learn the first time we touch a hot stove not to do that again, because obviously when we touch the stove that causes pain. We also have the idea here that within learning you have a response to a stimulus. And in the behaviorist mindset, the learner is acted on by the environment. And the key to instructional design here is to arrange appropriate stimuli that are going to provide the desired response from the learner. So the focus is on the stimuli and not so much on the learner themselves. We also have our two major ideas within this philosophy of reinforcement theory, which states that without reinforcing skills that we learn, then those skills will be lost, which I'm sure most of us can probably relate to. If you'll think back to some of the things you learned in grade school, middle school, junior high, you can probably not think very hard before you come up with something that you learned then that you have not used in a very long time, and thus you have lost that particular skill. Most things in life are not like riding a bike. We also have the idea here of positive and negative reinforcement. Both of these ideas were made most prominent by one B.F. Skinner and the research that he did. Moving on to cognitivism, here we have learning defined as occurring when we adapt or create certain schema to make sense of new information or data that we have come in contact with. We also have here the idea that individuals are naturally curious to learn and that we all learn best in different ways. So as a direct result of that belief, you'll find that this is a very learner-centered approach to learning. And here we're in direct contrast with the behaviorism philosophy in that our focus is solely on the learner. And if we believe the idea that all people learn best in different ways, then it only makes sense that we would need to design instruction in a variety of ways and use a variety of strategies to present our instruction so that we can meet each individual learner in the way that he or she learns best. Talking about the constructivism philosophy, here the best example to use would be the Socratic method, which has obviously been around for quite some time. Here we define learning as when an individual is able to construct or discover their own meaning from the content being presented, which is basically in a nutshell what the Socratic method is meant to do. You ask certain questions that are premeditated and open-ended rather than asking very direct questions in an attempt to allow the learner to arrive at their own conclusions. So you're guiding them instead of instructing them, so to speak. This would probably be the preferred method by most educators and instructors because without fail it seems that students are able to retain information much more effectively when they're able to construct their own meanings and discover their own meanings about certain content material. This particular approach lends itself well to workforce education in that if you're working with something that involves mechanical devices or electronic devices or anything that involves a lot of moving parts, here it's very easy to design instruction that allows for troubleshooting devices and coming in contact with all the moving parts and seeing how they work, and you're able to construct your own conclusions about different things along the way. A synthesis approach is really just taking all of these and meshing them together. And in reality, this is where most of us are going to fall because you have certain circumstances that lend themselves better to certain philosophies. You wouldn't want to use a philosophy that allows someone to discover how to use an arc welder or discover how to perform open heart surgery. So more often than not, you're going to have to amend your instruction to meet the needs of your learners. And at the same time, as a learner or as a student, you will have certain instructors, certain educators that are unable to teach in such a way that you learn best. So you're going to have to adapt and learn how to learn in different ways and under the constructs of different philosophies.
Now we will discuss education versus training. And the book really does an exceptional job in juxtaposing the two. But in reality, you can't have training without some form of education. If you think of education, you're thinking more of your classroom learning environment where you're allowing the learner to develop those independent thinking, problem solving skills, um, and the ability to make decisions. Therefore, you're going to utilize more of the constructivist learning philosophy, which allows the learner to discover their own meaning from the content provided. On the other hand, I like to think of training as more of on the job education or workforce education, um, and allowing the employee to learn a specific task or a standardized task effectively. For example, if you take healthcare, for instance, which is my background, we obtain a formal education where we're granted a degree. However, the next few years is critical in performing your job effectively, is the training that you receive. If you look at, you know, the biannual requirements to maintain your basic life supports certification, that's more training versus education. And you're going to utilize more of the behaviorist philosophy of learning, which states how the learner responds to a stimulus in the environment.
So how do we tie in education and how do we tie in training? Education, in my terms, is the book learning environment that you go through class, you get a degree in some type of field, so you have the education, but are you trained in that field? Students are not trained in that field until they take the educational piece and tie it together. For example, I'm a nurse. I went through nursing school, and during my didactic phase, I spent several months just doing classroom work. That was the education piece. And then the next several months, we did the clinical rotation, which tied in the training piece, which correlated the two together. So you had the education for your base knowledge, but the training tied in to tie the two together. So education and training ties in with one another, because you have the education, you have to train to get the experience that ties all two together.
So what sorts of variables are we going to encounter when we begin to design our instruction? I think without a doubt, the most impactful variable that all educators encounter is that of time. And the reason for that is because this is something that is 100% out of our control. We can't speed it up or slow it down. And you're always going to have these outside factors that are acting upon the time that you have allotted to you in the classroom. I know in the K-12 setting we have assemblies basically every week. You have announcements every morning, every afternoon, throughout the day. They're calling down to your room, wanting Johnny and Susie to come to the nurse's office or the principal's office or whatever. You're just constantly having these interruptions in your classroom. More in the workforce education realm of things, you have people that need time away from work for whatever reason. Maybe they're on vacation, maybe they're on maternity leave. You have illnesses, death in the family, things of that nature that also cause people to have to be away from work. And it's very unfortunate that you have all these outside factors because there's a fair amount of research that has put forth the idea that learning can and will take place if there is sufficient time for it to. John Carroll and Benjamin Bloom are two of the researchers that the textbook mentioned that have subscribed to this particular learning model that has the core belief of all students can learn if they have the time to learn. And I do believe that most educators in any setting would agree with this on a very fundamental level. However, the reality of the situation is that for some students, the time that they need to learn is going to far exceed that which is available. So in these particular circumstances, if you're a workforce education professional, then you're going to have to determine whether or not this task or this occupation is going to be appropriate for the individual, or are they actually going to be able to do this? And if you are an educator in the K-12 setting, you may have to determine whether or not it's time to look at an IEP plan or a 504 plan, some sort of modifications or accommodations that need to take place in order for this particular student to be able to have the time necessary for them to actually learn. You also have different ways in which you can define time within an instructional context. And the largest category of time here is going to be your school time or your training time. And this refers to the total amount of time allotted for you to present your curriculum. So whether that is a full school year or a semester or a 2-week training program, that's the total amount of time allotted. Within that, you have your classroom time, which is just the time that students actually spend within the learning setting. You have your instructional time, which is that time where actual instruction actually occurs. So this is when you're giving your lecture, you're giving your PowerPoint, you're presenting visual aids and charts and graphs and whatever it is that you've decided to do to present your curriculum. But without a doubt, the most important aspect here is going to be engaged time. And engaged time is defined as the portion of instructional time in which students are engaged in the process of learning. So it's extremely important for all educators to realize that one of the most critical elements in designing instruction is to design your instruction with the idea in mind that you want to maximize engaged time. And it has to start with the design process, because it's not something that happens naturally. You don't just get up in front of people and start talking about something you know a lot about and all of a sudden they become engaged in it. That very, very seldom happens. So you have to design your instruction with the sole intent of, I'm going to maximize the time in which my students are engaged. And for some students this means one thing, and for some students it means another. So again, it's up to you as the educator to assess your students' needs and then determine what needs to be done in order to design instruction that's going to maximize the time in which they're engaged. Of course, if you're going to discuss variables that occur when you're designing instruction, you have to mention learning styles. We spoke earlier about the idea put forth by the cognitive learning approach that individuals have preferred learning styles and learn best in certain ways, and that's going to be different from one individual to the next. An important further conclusion of this is that instructional designers and teachers themselves also have preferred learning styles, and it's likely that they will stress these styles when they design their instruction, even if it doesn't match their students' preferred styles. So very important as educators to keep that in mind, that when you're preparing and designing your instruction, be aware and be conscious of the fact that you do have a preferred learning style, and try to make sure that you don't always gear your instruction and design your instruction to your own personal preferred style of learning. Over the years, we've had a number of different learning style formats developed to help guide our design of instruction, and the one that we'll talk about here is one put forth by Culp and Smith, because this is the one mentioned in the textbook. And within this model, we have 4 different learning styles that are defined. We've got watchers, readers, doers, and sensors. And watchers are those who prefer to be shown how to do things. They learn best when the content or the task being taught is demonstrated. Readers, obviously, they prefer to read their instructions, and they learn best when they're left to their own devices to figure things out for themselves. Doers are those that learn best in a hands-on environment. They are trial and error type people and very tactile, tangible learners. They like to touch things and manipulate things with their hands, and do things. Sensory learners prefer to learn intuitively. They learn best when they're given the opportunity to construct their own meaning out of the content being presented. Obviously some of these learning styles are not going to lend themselves to all content knowledge. The sensory learning style, for example, is not going to be your preferred choice for teaching someone how to assemble some sort of mechanical device. Someone who prefers to learn with a sensory approach is not going to be able to learn very easily how to assemble something. That's more suited for someone that is a watcher or a doer. In your ideal, perfect educational setting, students would receive instruction that is geared only to their preferred learning style. But in reality, this is really just not feasible. So the solution to this is to design instruction that includes all four elements of learning, or all four styles of learning, rather, so that every student is able to get some learning out of different portions of your instruction. Having said that, I will allow Mr. Johnson to share some of his personal experiences with different types of learning styles.
Learning, when we talk about stimulating our students to learn, versus some students are more curious than others. They have a wider span, a wider base knowledge. So to keep them engaged, you have to kind of cater to their needs, because some are fast learners. Their brain is constantly absorbing information, and they're very curious, especially at younger ages, because they haven't had those life experiences yet, where you have to stimulate their minds to keep them engaged. Some may be well advanced in knowledge, where they get bored because you're not stimulating them enough to keep them engaged with the class. So tying back to our behaviors that we discussed earlier, you have to make sure that you keep an eye on your students and make sure they're engaged and not wandering off mentally into another realm where they need to stay focused on what's the current topic at hand. Okay?
This slide is pretty self-explanatory in terms of preparing for effective instruction. The research is very adamant on teacher preparation. Teacher preparation helps candidates develop the knowledge and skills they need in the classroom. Well-prepared teachers are more likely to remain in teaching. Well-prepared teachers produce higher student achievement. And this is pretty much across the board. If you think of any profession, the more skill, the more knowledge, and actually the more preparation you perform, the better results you will see. We cannot stress enough the importance of planning, making sure you have all your ducks in a row, including your lesson plans, your syllabus, making sure you have the resources you need to provide effective instruction, via asking for help, talking to more experienced teachers that have taught those courses before, and making sure that you have your resources available.
So as you prepare for your classes, there's some things that you have to do, and one of the things that you have to do as far as your course preparation goes is to make sure you got the right equipment, the right students, and you got all the forms and documents that you need. Make sure your students know what books to have and what chapters to cover prior to class. One of the ways that we do that here is I have what I call training site faculty that monitor the instructors here, so that when they teach a class, we have a seasoned instructor there with our new instructors, or some, just to make sure that they're all teaching to the same standard. American Heart Association is who is our lead on our training here, so we have to make sure we comply with their guidelines. And the only way to do that is to monitor our instructors and encourage them We do instructor updates, annual updates for our instructors to let them know the latest research and technology. I send emails out to them on research data that will help improve their course curriculum and the way they present their classes.
There are three guiding principles of instructional design suggested by the textbook. The first of which is the consistency principle, which states that from beginning to end, you need to stay consistent in what you're doing. So you need to keep in mind your curriculum, your learning objectives, your instructional strategies, as well as your assessment techniques. And you need to consider all of this beforehand and make sure that throughout the design process, throughout the instructional process, that you're remaining consistent. So for example, if our objective is to reduce defects in a manufacturing process, then it would be consistent to provide instruction that includes some manner of hands-on instruction rather than some sort of lecture or note-taking instruction. As an extension of the consistency principle, we have the adequacy principle, and here we learn that instruction is most effective when the strategies are adequate to teach the content. And this is going to depend upon what the material is. Are we talking about teaching facts? Are we talking about teaching concepts? Are we talking about teaching procedures? So based upon what it is that you're trying to instruct upon, that's going to determine what your instructional strategies need to be. So for example, if your objective is to teach concepts, then your instruction is going to need to include examples, non-examples, definitions, things of that nature. If your objective is to teach procedures, then you're going to need to provide all the steps that go along with this procedure, and then also probably need to demonstrate that procedure as well. So this really just goes back to the idea of make sure that your instruction matches your learning objectives and stays consistent. So again, we're just having an extension of the consistency principle here. The mastery principle is based upon the idea of scaffolding. And what scaffolding is basically starting with a very simple task or idea. And once you have shown mastery of that task, then you'll move on to the next task, which is going to be just a little bit more difficult than the one that you just mastered. And then once you master that task, then you'll move on to another one, which is a little more difficult. And you'll keep going through this hierarchy of tasks, each one more difficult than the last, until you have mastered all of the tasks in front of you and mastered all of the objectives that are asked of you. More often than not, the type of instructional strategy that we decide to use is going to begin with a consideration of our available resources. You see here figure 9.1 types of instructional media that we pulled from the textbook. Somewhat outdated list, but you might be surprised the amount of schools that still don't have projectors in every room, laptops in every room. When I first started teaching my very first job, this was February of 2013. I walked into my classroom and I had a chalkboard, a couple of pieces of chalk, and an eraser, and that was all. So, and this is a 6A high school, a very large high school. So again, you might be kind of surprised with some of the resources available even this day and age with all the technology. Not all schools are as fortunate to have all of those things. But again, your decision of instructional strategies is a lot of times going to be based upon the resources available. And at this time, I'll step aside again and allow Mr. Johnson to provide some of his personal experiences and provide another aspect on this particular topic.
So one of the things we're going to discuss at this time is behaviors when you incorporating your students into the learning environment. Students of today learn differently than the students of years ago, where they're used to everything being fast-driven and fast-paced. So some of the behaviors you're going to see nowadays is utilizing technology in your training sequences. For example, cell phones, laptops, smartphones, video-based training, web-enhanced training. They're all incorporated into the adult learner to increase their capabilities in learning knowledge, where they don't have to sit in a traditional classroom to gather that information and to gather that knowledge. The adult learners of today are a lot different than those of yesterday, where they're used to things being right there and being fast-driven and fast-paced. So, how do you know if it's effective or not? What are the tools that you can use? One of the tools you can use is written examination, hands-on tests, and you can do take a strong look. I call it the mirror. Look in the mirror and see how you're doing. Your students have a better look at you, and what we do here at McHargue is we do course evaluation forms. Those course evaluation forms have areas where students can make comments, and they can be either positive or negative comments. And what I tell my instructors is, don't take the negative as something bad. Learn from it so that you can be a better instructor and better presenter. So let's talk about some of the things you may see in your students make sure as an instructor or a teacher that you're keeping your students engaged. One thing you can determine whether they're on track is if they're continuously looking at the book trying to find what page you're on. You may need to slow down your presentation and make sure that they understand before you move forward. In the classes that I teach, when I teach a BLS class, for example, if I notice a student is not watching me and making that eye contact, and they give me the nonverbals like the arms crossed and they're looking down and not really paying attention to me, then I try to engage them by giving them direct questions so that I can get direct feedback from them before I move on to the next topic. So if you watch your students' behaviors and the way that they sit and their mannerisms, you'll be able to pick up on whether you're able to move on at a continuous pace or you need to slow it down to make sure all students learn.
Malcolm Knowles, who is considered the father of U.S. adult education, put a lot of emphasis with andragogy, and his theory can be stated with 6 assumptions related to motivation of the adult learner. The first one is the need to know. Adults need to know the reason for learning. The second is foundation. Experience provides the basis for learning activities. The third is self-concept. Adults need to be responsible for their decision on education and with the involvement in the planning and evaluation of their instruction. Readiness. Adults are more interested in learning subjects that will have a immediate impact to their work and or personal lives. Orientation. Adults learning is problem-centered rather than content-oriented. Motivation. Adults respond better to internal versus external motivators. This table does a really good job in contrasting pedagogy versus andragogy. And I'm not going to actually go through the table. The main take-home message is that adults are motivated by career advancement, meaning they want to learn things that are relevant for job performance, increase in responsibility, or salary. So we must structure their learning towards advancement in their career. And I believe that's the main emphasis of workforce education, is to help the adult learner achieve their goals and ultimately career advancement. This concludes our presentation on Chapter 9, Instructional Design and Workforce Education. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the different philosophies of learning, to be able to differentiate between education versus training, understand the different variables in instructional design, be able to prepare for effective instruction in workforce education, understand the difference for adult learners comparing pedagogy versus andragogy. We would also like to take this time to thank Mr. Johnson for taking time out his busy schedule to help us prepare for this presentation. Thank you.